Thank you for coming on a Monday evening in person, and thank you to everyone else online. My name is Neha Sami. I anchor the research program here at IIHS, and I'm also with the School of Environment and Sustainability. We're delighted to have, in some ways, the closing panel from a process that started a couple of years ago on work for the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. And we have both colleagues here who've been part of a closing workshop over the last 3 or 4 days, together with our team from IHS. And what we're going to present to you is just a series of reflections on both the work that we've done through the commission, but also work that sits alongside the work that we do for the commission on thinking through transitions to sustainable futures, particularly using water and water systems in the context of the urban as an entry point into there. So I'll hand it over to Aro, who will chair the discussion, and we're looking forward to a really vibrant conversation both with you here and online. So thank you all.
Thanks, Neha. So we had the beginning of this conversation started maybe a couple of years ago, with a number of us in the room who were there. But let me quickly introduce my colleagues on the panel. So to my extreme left is Joyeeta Gupta, professor at the Free University of Amsterdam and at IHE Delft. She is a lady for all times and all seasons. Uh, she's a lawyer, she's a social scientist, a climate scientist who's done remarkable work over many decades just now on the confluence between justice, development, and the environment, and is also a Spinoza laureate. The Spinoza Prize is the Dutch equivalent of the Nobel Prize, among many other things that she's done over the years. She's also been the co-chair of the Earth Commission, which has actually pushed the boundaries of a whole range of questions. And I think today we'll hear from Joyeeta on, some of the core framing ideas that the Earth Commission, and she's kind of led that in multiple articles from the Commission in the Lancet, in Nature, and other such things. And we work together on the Global Commission on the Economics of Water, trying to push the boundaries, maybe not as far as we would like to have, in the direction of going beyond economics into other spaces. To my immediate left is Jagdish Krishnaswamy, the Dean of IIHS School of Environment and Sustainability. Jagdish is one of the world's leading eco-hydrologists who works in tropical regions, also a coordinating lead authors of the IPCC, extensive work across multiple geographies, apart from Asia and India, where he's worked, I guess, across most ecosystems, also in Africa and Latin America and North America, which is a rare kind of experience set to actually do research and engage with questions of the environment across all of these areas. To my right is Kavita Wankhade. Kavita is the Associate Dean of IIHS School of Systems and Infrastructure. She has over many years led a whole range of challenging and interesting initiatives, starting from work on the curriculum that we hope to roll out not so far down the line, as part of IHS's transition into becoming a university. But over the last many years, she's led one of the largest interventions in India and one of the largest interventions in the world looking at water and sanitation, the Tamil Nadu Urban Sanitation Program, and another very interesting part of of a program that's tied to that, which looked at inclusive sanitation. But of course, today she's going to be talking much more about the water sector. So that's kind of the background. I'm Aromar Revi. I'm the director of IHS, and I work on a number of things, including climate and water and a few other things. So just to set the tone, we are looking significantly at IHS and otherwise at a whole process of transitions. And, in some senses, the one big transition that ties together much of our work and work of many other colleagues across the world is the process of urbanization. And I guess the question for us in this part of the 20th century, there is, at least for many of us, not so much of a debate of whether we're in the Anthropocene or not. Technically, the geologists may be, or stratigraphers may believe that we're not completely, we haven't tied down that schema. But basically, we're working in an Anthropocene environment. And in that, I would say the process of urbanization is a mega trend. So over the 19th and 20th century in Europe and North America, we saw a process of a large proportion of population moving into urban areas, which has certain implications. But most significantly, from the economic point of view, essentially what it meant is the transition out of primary production, agriculture, forestry, fisheries, maybe even mining in some places, into secondary activity. The process of modernization, which led to sort of industrial economies, and then of course starting in the post-war period, the transition into the so-called service sector economies. Now, India, fortunately or unfortunately, doesn't sort of fall into this frame. We've always been, for a long period of time, a service sector dominated economy, not because we went through that transition that other countries have gone through, which China is currently, in the process of accelerating, but because we've had a large proportion of people who've been involved traditionally in the service sector. They didn't actually own one of the most important assets that are still important in the 21st century, especially as far as water is concerned, and that is land. So we have large proportions of people who did not actually own land. They were service castes. They were involved in a whole range of other occupations. So services are very important. So I guess one of the core questions that we're trying to examine today is, in a world that is urbanizing or significantly urban, if you go to Latin America or North America, you have, maybe only 5 to 10% of the population living in rural areas or living off farm based or primary sector based occupations. uh, what implication does it have as far as water is concerned? And does water actually, does it have a significant positive impact on cities, or the other way around? Do cities actually have an impact on water? And if you look at I guess, the history of what's happened in this country, in this particular state, for example, and you look at Hampi, go back 500 years or so, you see the relationship between cities and water are very intimately tied together, because effectively, uh, as you agglomerate large populations, this is one core service, or one core sets of infrastructure that in effect define not only what happens inside the city, but if it is not organized outside the city, you can't actually build cities in some senses. Before you had industrialization, agrarian economies were critically related to the availability of water for agriculture to increase production, etc. So even if you look at our own campus is situated on the edge of a tank, which is almost 700 plus years old, and that tank was built in the 14th century or so, primarily to increase agricultural production in this landscape. So as landscapes shift, as economies shift, what's the relationship between the two? And I guess one of the core challenges we have is that cities create lots of opportunities. They create opportunities for employment. Much of the world's incremental employment is coming from cities, especially in the global south at the current point of time. They create opportunities for economic output. So, anywhere between 70 to 85%, depending on what you count, where you count it, of economic output across the world comes from urban areas. Fine. Uh, Most of our critical cultural institutions, most of our higher education institutions are concentrated in urban areas. So tremendous opportunity in these spaces, but with that opportunity comes a lot of challenges. And the oldest challenges we found have been, I would say, two things. One is, how do you provide food to people in cities? And cities don't grow much of their own food even now, even though some of us are trying to change that trend. And the second thing is, how do you provide clean water, and how do you deal with the wastewater and all the human feces and sanitation that comes from large concentrations of people in urban context? Because the thing about urban context, like we learned in COVID, is the more you concentrate people, the more you create a pool where you can have continuous whatever epicenters of disease. So these two things, I would say, if you were to focus on them, are very, very critical, apart from something else which is important in the industrial economy. As we make our transition now into, let's say, renewables in many parts of the world, what we don't completely realize is, even though you may have a solar PV, panels on your roof, and you feel that you're pretty good, you're not using a lot of coal-fired power and stuff like that. In actual fact, there's a tremendous amount of water that's gone into the extraction of lithium, into its processing, and the making of those cells. So in some senses, the global water footprints, or our own individual and regional and city water footprints, are actually quite large. Stuff that we use in the city, which is may not be very much, maybe less than 10% of what's actually being used at a national level, but also stuff that comes from everything that we draw. And city water footprints, as we'll hear from many people around the table just now, have been expanding dramatically. And one of the challenges we're facing across the world, especially in this context, and particularly in this city, is that our footprints are becoming not only unsustainable, but are being subject to conflict. Right? So if you have a city which is not able to handle water within its own boundaries. In the old days, you know, when you had a wall around the city, effectively, when the city was under siege, you had to manage with the water resources inside the city, fine, and that determined how long the siege would last, or how long you were able to hold out against something else. So food and water were very important. But in the post-industrial period, we're either drawing water from very far away, from sources that may be 300 or 400 kilometers away, because you can pump it that far. You have the energy, you have the pumping systems, and you have the infrastructure to make it happen. Or we're using more and more groundwater, and you're going deeper and deeper. And the city, in that sense, is really, I would say, uh, you know, it's at serious risk to questions of drought. And why is this important? Because in a changing environment, especially with climate change, one thing that's certain about the Indian subcontinent is that much of the Indian subcontinent is going to see more rainfall, which in some senses seem to be a good thing, because drought has been significant part of history in this country, both on the agriculture side and as far as cities are concerned. But the fact is that rainfall that we might see in most parts of the country that's going to increase is going to happen in a much shorter period of time. So what that means is landscapes that were designed for rainfall patterns that have persisted for a few hundred years in some cases, whether it's in cities or in agricultural areas, in some senses, will come much at a much narrow frequency, which means that you have at one end drought and you have flooding at the same time. So this is something that seems kind of contradictory. But the fact is, if the peaks become higher and the peaks become sharper and they come at much narrow frequencies, or you have more extreme weather, you will have drought and flooding in the same area. Adding to that, of course, is a challenge of large urban concentrations, poor management of services, which are far from universal across most of our cities, especially in many parts of India. You have a huge problem of fecal contamination, or let's say human-based pollution, and then because of industrial activity and a whole range of other stuff, you have pollution. So basically, the core challenge we have is we have the challenge of too little water across much of the world. You have that across the subcontinent as far as India is concerned. You have the challenge of too much water in many places. Some places are endemically exposed to flooding, and places that were not flooded earlier, as climate is going to become more intense, as we move from whatever it is, 1.1, 1.2 degrees almost above the pre-industrial temperature average to 1.5, that will become a problem. Plus, we have the challenge of pollution, water pollution. But the interesting thing that we find in cities is you're also concentrating other forms of pollution. You have air pollution that's actually functioning, which is actually in some ways one of the most critical challenges. And when air and water pollution come together, then you have a very, very livable environment. India's competing now to become one of the most livable environments in the world, because you're bringing all these processes together. Now, these are all sort of complex questions that are tied to each other. And I guess part of the challenge that we have is they're aggregating now in such a way that you don't only have problems that are local problems of drought and flooding and too much water, too little water, its impact on poor people and vulnerability, but it aggregates now to the regional scale. In some cases, some countries, thankfully in India, at least our research shows, is that our water balances at the current point of time are unequal, but you know we're still not completely out of water in most places in the country. There are serious pressures and there are constraints, but very soon we'll be significantly out of even basic water to be able to provide livelihoods, to provide food security, and certainly to provide water security for large proportions of the population. So as that shift starts taking place, this becomes the site of significant conflict or opportunities for both social and economic innovation, because water has an impact on health and hence on life expectancy and quality of life. It also has a critical link to livelihoods, which we often forget. So I think one of the questions that we're going to try and look at is, both at the city scale and at the regional scale, what are these linkages and how can they be unbundled, and how can we deal with this in a systemic sense? Because if this is a systemic crisis, you can't deal with it by dealing with one thing at a time. You can't deal with flooding at one time and deal with drought at another. You have to bring them all together. And because water runs through much of the whole development process, this makes it a very complex thing to deal with. And we are living in an environment in which both the state sector and even civil society to some extent, and certainly the private sector, are fragmented. So everybody tries to deal with their problem in a particular silo. They believe they can trade off one thing with the other. And as a result, you have at one end unintended consequences, or you have serious impacts on some people who shouldn't be impacted at all. So the poor and vulnerable are faced with the most serious challenges. And in some senses, because historical water entitlements are linked to questions of land, it means that our access to water historically, both within cities and outside cities, has been highly unequal. I think one of the core questions which we'll try and answer today or try and discuss today is how does one deal with these questions of justice, inequality, access, and as Joyeeta says, the three I's. How do you deal with intragenerational equity issues? How do you deal with intergenerational equity? Because if you're taking away the water or you're polluting significantly, not only rivers but groundwater, you're really taking away from the future in some senses, or from our own, our own communities. And finally, the most critical question as we enter into a serious biodiversity crisis or an emergency, and that is what is the impact on other species and where does interspecies justice lie? So, how do you relate these three things? And we know for a fact that we're now reaching very, very critical boundaries in terms of water usage and its linkage with other systems. Similarly, at the same time, we have huge disparities in terms of access and functionality of our systems, of which, by and large, at least in the global south, in India, and in the city also, significant proportions of the services that we're talking about are delivered largely in what we call in rather lazily informally off-grid systems. So these don't fit the normal frameworks for intervention either by states or by large-scale private sector stuff. So there's some intermediary locations that we want to look at and pick up and do things. So I mean, given that broad canvas, Jagdish, do you want to kick off on what the biophysical challenges are like and where you see this actually playing itself out and where it'll actually work? And how does it relate to cities?
So, Aro mentioned about how cities' water footprints are something that are a concern. Um, Many cities will have to, for in at least in the foreseeable future, depend on water that's going to come from other places. This is a reality. But there are good examples of stewardship where cities can invest in the green and blue infrastructure or the natural assets that provide clean drinking water to cities. So there are examples from India. The Shimla water catchment sanctuary was set up, in pre-colonial times and continued to function well after independence. And that was a source of water for Shimla. So there was an imagination that a protected catchment um, would be able to provide clean drinking water to a city. So Mumbai gets its water from the Tulsi, Vetarna, and other water bodies, which are again part of the Borivali forest area, protected. Um, we So cities in New York, for example, gets its water from the Catskill Mountains, and that's a celebrated example of investment in conservation area that also provides clean drinking water to a large city. So there is a connection between conservation and the protection of natural assets and benefits to a city. So that's just one connection that needs to be strengthened for those cities that will continue to rely on water that's going to come from out far away. On the other hand, increasingly cities have to reduce their water footprint, and one potential is to treat wastewater, because what cities do, we all do, is we take clean water from ecosystems and we convert it into blue water, fresh blue water, and convert it into black water. Now, even if a good fraction of that black water is treated, it's a resource that could help maintain green and blue infrastructure in our cities. So our cities are warming, as Aro was mentioning. So we need the cooling from water bodies, and the evaporation from water bodies and the transpiration from vegetation is what keeps Delhi and Bengaluru and Hyderabad and Nagpur actually cooler than what they would have been in the absence of this service. Now, uh, green and blue infrastructure requires water, and this water is often comes from seepages and leakages or is subsidized. So basically, you are using some of the precious water for actually maintaining this green and blue infrastructure, whether it's in New Delhi or in Bengaluru or elsewhere. In the future, we'll have to use treated wastewater to maintain our green and blue infrastructure, because otherwise, if we add up all the numbers, it's going to be really difficult. We are already talking about Bengaluru. We already get water from the Kaveri and we pump it uphill. Now there is talk of bringing water from the Sharavati. So clearly cities have to play some role in reducing their water footprint, and one way is through recycling wastewater, conserving water, and more efficient use of water within the city. So that's one angle. The second is that Aru was mentioning the biodiversity crisis. And we always see cities as places where nature is always in retreat, not a place for biodiversity. We'll have to change this paradigm, because we are urbanizing very quickly, and we will be the intersection between so-called semi-wild and the city is going to shrink. So an increasing amount of area is going to come under some form of urbanization. And if we do not have a space for biodiversity in these urbanizing places, then our goal of having 30% of inland land, terrestrial, and water under some form of conservation by 2030 is going to be very difficult to achieve. So cities have to play a role as refugia for biodiversity. And if you take the case of Bengaluru, we still many cities, Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, Bengaluru, all of them are pretty rich in biodiversity. I mean, Bengaluru has about 300 species of birds. We have slender lorises. We have leopards on our outskirts. So the opportunity for a new model of conservation of biodiversity in the city is right now. And there is now an instrument which has been recently been talked about called the Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measures, or OECM, by the IUCN. Now that's basically any type of land or water which is used for some other purpose, like say an educational campus or an institutional campus, or some other type of land that is employing people and providing other services to people, but it also has a biodiversity co-benefit. So if you qualify, then you could declare many spaces in the city as OECMs, which would add to our conservation target. So that's again integration of water ecology and climate resilience with within the city. So these are some opportunities that we need to seize, and we also have to avoid some of the mistakes that we have made when we have done conservation in other areas, the so-called wild or semi-wild areas, where the burden of conservation has often been placed on people who did not create that problem, and often it have to bear the burden of conservation. So I think that in the cities, when we're talking about nature-based solutions, blue and green infrastructure, we have to be very careful about ecological justice. Ecological justice of two dimensions. One is basically that when we do conservation, we do not displace people, or we treat them justly. So just conservation. And the second is access to nature for everybody in the city. So these are the two things that if we can achieve by avoiding the mistakes and models that we have followed in other areas, I think that would be a way forward.
Thanks. So, I mean, three or four key things there. First, of course, shrinking water footprints, whether first order or second order footprints in terms of food and other things, very important. And we have the technologies now to do it. We know how to make that happen. The question there, I guess, is the governance frameworks and implementation. The second thing is really not reaching out too much into the, into the rural or the hinterland areas, and effectively stealing water from rural communities, from people who actually will have much less of it. Then within that, looking at, or across that landscape, looking at the availability of water for critical ecosystem services and conservation, which is important, because if the wild and the semi-wild and the agricultural areas are not healthy, if the ecosystems are not healthy, the cities eventually will not survive. I mean, there's this whole thing that we have technological fixes for everything, but water is one space that really shows us where we could actually deal with. Just one quick question before I jump to Kavita on this. What do we do with pollution? How does it play itself out in this? I mean, if you're going to recycle a lot of water, Is that going to, how are we going to deal with all the nutrients and nitrogen, the phosphorus, all the stuff that we're bringing to the city in our food and in our products? Does that work? Does the circular economy work not only for that?
To some extent, certainly, I think that the food waste is, if we can actually segregate food waste from other types of waste, that is a really rich source of nutrients and resource that can be used for restoration of degraded urban soils, for even urban farming, possibly even the peri-urban agriculture. So that is one aspect. So that is that, but the whole point is that we have to have between citizens and government and other parts of society, we really need to do a better job of ensuring that the different types of waste can be segregated well, because then that definitely makes it much easier for the circular economy to operate. So that's one part. The second part is, of course, the treated wastewater. It is a potentially important source of nutrients for some forms of agriculture, but also for sustaining the blue and green infrastructure within the cities. So that's those are two aspects. What is really worrying about the types of pollutants and contaminants that we are now generating are antibiotics, pharmaceutical waste, the type of cosmetics and household materials that we have. When all of that plus a little bit of industrial effluents gets mixed up, then the ability of nature-based solutions, or for matter any type of wastewater or waste treatment facilities, is going to be at risk.
And also plastics.
Yes,
Because
and plastics is the
are
next
kind
thing.
of
I think that
everywhere.
all of us probably have quite a bit of plastics within us by now.
Yeah.
So that's going to be the next next thing to worry about.
Thanks. Kavita, Jagdish has given us this larger framework of how the relationship between biodiversity, non-urban areas in some senses, because the urban continuum is quite large, plays itself out, and what are the kind of challenges we have to deal with. But I mean, the biophysical domain is one element of it, but there are also serious challenges, or lots of innovation that's possible on the institutional side, on the governance frame side. So any thoughts on that? Because you've spent many years trying to sort these kind of challenges out in place, and how does one take that into the policy domain? How does one take that into the practice, and how does one build theory around this, which can actually change the way that we try and look at the world and where water fits in it?
I'm not sure how we can build theory about it, but I can answer to the other questions. So, just to start off by saying that I think my colleagues have said that the transitioning is important because the footprints are decreasing, and so it has impact on urban areas, and also urban areas have a negative impact, especially on the pollution side. But just to bring to the forefront, the reality is that a large percentage of population still doesn't have water and sanitation, and I just want to ground it in that. And the numbers are 20% don't have water access and around 35% sanitation, but those numbers are underestimates, because when you're looking at those measures, you're just looking whether you have a safe source of water, but we all know it's not a static thing. There are seasonal variations, there are the quality issues, all of which have not been measured. So I think the challenge is to transition, uh, face the ecological transitions we are going through while still meeting this goal, which has not been met, and we are pretty much not going to meet SDG 6. So to answer to your question of what is needed, let me start from what I think at the highest level, and I'm going to talk about nuts and bolts. But the first thing, I think we need shift in paradigms. So three key shifts that I see, linked to what Jagdish said. So one is that we need safe water and sanitation for all now. And let me unpack that. By safe, I mean we can go into technical definition, but we often forget just having water is enough. There's an issue of quality, and Jagdish brought out there's an increasing challenge of microbial challenges, new contaminants coming. That's one. Second is all, which means leaving nobody behind, which is the aim of SDGs, but doesn't work out because you leave some vulnerable population. And third is now, which means you can't wait for another SDG successor to come, but we really have to make do with what we have, and I hope I'm able to shed some light on that. Second paradigm shift, and this is again moving from what you and Jagdish had said, but from a lens of a city, is to move from just looking at toilets and pipes and water supply taps to the full cycle. And I think the argument what Jagdish made is that that cycle has to start earlier. It has to start from the source, and then you supply water, and then it becomes wastewater, and then you treat it, and really look at the whole chain. And which again was not the paradigm, and which is the third one, that the city managers, and when the cities were set up, because the ecology was not what it was, and uh, the goal of the city was to supply water to everybody and to provide sanitation services, which is why London started off by making sewers but just dumping it in the Thames, right? But that has to shift by saying that that is not the goal. The goal is to provide these services in an ecologically consistent manner. And I think that is a fundamental paradigm shift that needs to happen with the manager, city manager. So those were the top, I would say, high level paradigm shifts. The other two things I will quickly not debunk, but just put them in place before moving on to institution. One is that we talk a lot about technology, and technology is very important. And even in today's day and age, one cannot discount the possibility of a disruptive technology or technologies coming, which will shift how we provide these services. But the fact is, for now, we have the technologies. It's not that you don't have the tech that is there. What we need to do is to deploy it in a way that's consistent, that works for, say, a high density place versus a low density place, and not get up in what I think a false debate of this is right and this is wrong. I think the question is not what is the right technology for a city, but what is the right mix of technologies required. I'm putting this out here because many debates on WASH just fall into this, and I think it's just a waste of everybody's energy. And the other thing is about also recognizing that a lot of infrastructure requires retrofitting. Many countries are going through the issue of aging infrastructure, and about operation and maintenance. About that, I'll speak in a while. Second, a lot is said about lack of finance, and which is a problem. But we've just done a survey, which my colleagues Mahima and Santosh did. We require around 5% of the total GDP to meet this need. I think if we all get our heads together, we'll be able to cobble it. But what we don't talk about is that you're not sometimes, even when the money is available, and this data shows this in India, but also in sub-Saharan Africa, you're not able to spend that money. And that's because the institutional capacity is not there. The objective capacity is not there. And second, many of the discussion around funding actually just limited to capital investments. What happened to the operation and maintenance? And that usually comes down to either the communities or the urban local bodies who don't have the capacity. And that kind of brings me, in a sense, to what you said is what will work, what is required. And I think two areas which are talked about, but I would put them in the center. One is behavior change and communication. And again, I want to say behavior change for communication, not for the poor, not for the vulnerable only, but behaviors as in what Jagdish mentioned. People consume less water, which includes all of us, or the institutions need to change the way they behave when they talk about water. That was one. And I feel the key is around institutions. And you have to strengthen the institutions. We looked at the literature, we talked to people, and you're like, what is the clear? I'm not sure if they're very clear answer, but what seems to be evolving, two, three things. One is that the role of government is absolutely key. So this is not to say that you can't have services delivered by the private sector, but you do need to say that water and sanitation is a service that's provided by the state, by the government, and we need strengthening there. Now, whether it's the urban local body or the state or a centralized form, there are a lot of normative debates. And if you ask me personally, I'll say decentralization. But interestingly, the data is actually saying that as far as service delivery of water and sanitation goes, it could be centralized also, as long as certain other criteria of accountability, etc., met, right? Things that need to work for institution, again, one of the things is that it's not enough to talk about just capacities of ULBs or the state governments. It's important to talk about the politics of it, because water is inherently political. We all know that. But even at the city level, I'm not even talking about transboundary or interbasin things. Pricing remains a deeply political issue. Who gets water remains a deeply political issue until you have the government and the government specific champions championing for it. It's not going to work. Next is, I think we need to strengthen incentives. We often talk about capacity building. Again, I will say within the institutions, what is it in there for the actual people sitting on the ground? And if that incentive is not aligned with their personal career trajectories, it's not going to work. And last is the issue of trust. And this is often not talked about, but if there is no trust in the communities that you're serving and the government, it's not going to work. Um, and last point that I want to end with is there is a huge informal markets that are actually providing these services. They are often characterized as exploitative. Again, in some cases they might be, but the reality is that they're stepping in to provide a need that the governments are not fulfilling, and much of their higher cost may actually be because they are not availing the subsidies that the government themselves are getting to provide, say, water. And we need to find a way of working with them. And there are now good examples from India, in Tamil Nadu, the work we did, but also in certain countries in Africa, where the informal systems are actually working together with the government systems, and with what is called light regulation, and they're becoming complementary system rather than conflicting with each other. So those are some of the ways, but we have to, more work has to be done to figure out how we can, in a way, work more with informal systems. I'll end there.
Thanks. Joyeeta, to be a little provocative, Kavita, having worked so much in the space, is telling us that, well, markets do work in some senses for water, maybe informal markets. She didn't actually say that, but I'm being provocative here. And we have the technologies, fine. And maybe we can muster up the finance. So, in this environment in which we, at one end, we are saying, okay, we're hitting boundaries at one end, there's deep inequality, water itself is very unequal. How do you square this circle?
Um, I think so. Maybe I try to take this slightly differently. So, if you are a very rich person and you think you can keep buying products and goods and commodities, then our research shows that actually you can't, because you've crossed your personal footprint. So, in many ways, that could mean that there's enough money left over amongst the super rich people in the country and abroad for this kind of work. The problem is that when they put that money into development banks or into investment banks or into some kind of pension system, then those systems invest money. And when they want to invest money, they want a return on investment. So, for example, one of my students has worked on, if you do a project in Germany, you want a 6% rate of interest. If you do it in Tanzania, you want a 24% rate of interest. This is because in Germany, you are more or less sure you'll get your money back, but in Tanzania, you're afraid you won't get your money back. Now, that logic exists. But on top of that, you then ask the government to give you a sovereign guarantee. So you don't need that extra interest. But still, that's the way the market works. So when you get a private sector actor from a rich country to come to, not when you get a private sector actor to come to another country and make an agreement with the municipality or the central government, they want more interest than normally you would be expected to pay if you did a community based financing approach, or if local communities did some kind of private initiative and did a business. B, and that's the work of my colleague in this room, Hilma, when these foreign companies come in, then they sign a contract with the municipality. Now, these contracts are not subject to Government of India law. They're not subject to the government of the country where they work, because there's a foreign investor and a local government. And what happens is then those investors are protected under bilateral investment treaties. Now, Government of India at some point thought that we are very clever. We won't make these agreements with Western countries. We will just make it with this country of Mauritius or some other poorer countries, relatively poorer countries. And so we protect ourselves from this problem. But we saw in the Enron case that then there was a subsidiary in Mauritius, and then it became part of the bilateral agreement. So what I'm trying to say basically is, suppose the Government of India decides the foreign financer is charging too much, or it's not working and we want to close it down, they can sue the Government of India under an international investment treaty, and they can play the system to make sure that they are able to secure this. And this is not just an Indian problem. Even in the Netherlands, foreign investors in the energy market are not letting the Dutch government phase out fossil fuel based on the argument that they should be paid compensation. Okay, so this is a very big problem about private national law. That's to talk about the squaring storyline. So there's two storylines. One is we need to come and explain to rich people you can't really spend your money because you're beyond your footprint. Second is to try and make sure that the way in which we get loans are actually open to the public so people can investigate what is the interest rate, or what is the actual cost, because there are many tricks to the system. It's not just the interest rate, there are all kinds of costs that are added up. And secondly, what kind of law applies? Does international law apply or does national law? But I want to go back to my little story because we talked a bit about justice. So we look at, I want to make 5 points. Point one is, when you look at the justice scholarship, it's often about climate justice, energy justice, water justice, or it's about local justice. And our narrative is that in this current world, you need systemic justice. So the justice systems must be linked across issue areas, but also across levels. Because if the foreign investor can play a role in your injustice, then there should be a link also with that system. So basically, we are talking about creating a systemic justice approach, which we call earth system justice or water system justice. And in that justice, two elements are very important. The first element is, do we recognize the poorest? So when you're looking at a company, they say, did I get cost recovery? And the question for the company should actually be, did you achieve the goals? But that's not the issue for them, it is cost recovery. So for us, we are saying that from a justice perspective, recognition justice is the most important. Did you put the last first, or did you just give the urban poor water? Second, epistemic justice. What kind of system did you use? Did you bring a state of the art, expensive toilet system into a country, or did you try to use something that works in that particular context? So those are the two justice starting points. Then we go to interspecies justice, intergenerational justice, and intra-generational justice. And most economics does not deal with interspecies justice, and intergenerational justice is dealt with very minutely. And even intra-generational justice across borders is pretty poor. So then the question is, how do we organize this, and how do we create a shaping of the institutions that deliver on these goods and services? That's the justice story. And then justice also has process and substance. So when you translate this, what does this mean? I'm coming to point two. When you translate this, this means how much water can you use in the system. So in our research, we came up with the narrative that surface water should not vary more than 20% on a monthly basis at given points of the river flow. And this is to enable the ecosystems in the river to function, because those ecosystems are also very important, not just for the species in the water, but also for cleaning the water, for providing us all kinds of different services. That's the first target. And of course, the question is, what should the appropriate baseline be? The second target is, do not take out more water from the groundwater system than you recharge. So if you can find a better way to recharge water, fine, you can use a little bit more water. But the idea is you keep it in balance. And why do you do it? The social arguments are, if you take out too much water, there's a vacuum underneath. And that vacuum can lead to the land subsiding and the houses on top and the schools, etc. Alternatively, the vacuum leads to salt water entering the groundwater system. So your freshwater system becomes salty. So those are the two reasons for that. So these are the two water boundaries that we have, and they can be quite local. You can translate them to local areas. The second boundary that is important is the boundary on climate. So for us, 1.5 is very important, because beyond 1.5, the entire climatic system becomes unpredictable because of global tipping points and regional tipping points. But 1.5 is not just in our view. We chose 1 degree centigrade. And now let me explain what this means. When we're talking about 1 degree, it is 1 degree against pre-industrial levels. So that pre-industrial level is made into 0 degrees, and then we calculate the temperature rise against that. So we are saying 1 degree centigrade rise is more just because even 1 degree means that about 70 million people worldwide will be exposed to death from extreme high temperature and extreme high humidity, even if it is a very short period of time, in the period of 1 day. So that's what we have calculated. And beyond that, of course, you have extreme weather events and you have slow weather events that create all kinds of problems. So roughly 1% of the global population is hopefully protected by the 1 degree target. Today we are at 1.27 or something like that, and we are moving very close to 1.3. We expect by the end of 2030, sorry, by 2030, we will have crossed 1.5. By 2040, we will have crossed 2 degrees. And that means that your entire water system will change because almost all climate impacts work through water. So every 1 degree rise in temperature increases evaporation into the air by 7%. And this means that you will have more rainfall and more moisture and more sudden rainfall events. And of course, heating reduces. Um, it leads to more glacial melt, so more water comes down quickly. It leads to rising sea levels, saltwater intrusion. Almost everything of climate is working through water. So it's important. And the third one is biodiversity. I want to come back to what Jagdish was saying. So in our narrative, not that it is very, it may sound contradictory, but it's not. It's sort of parallel. In our narrative, we separate intact nature from managed lands. And intact nature includes nature where communities live, indigenous communities live there, local communities live there. That's fine because they've maintained the intact nature for a long time. So we are saying that today we are around at 45% globally, and we need to get to 60%. You could do around 50 to 53% if you force tropical countries that are rich in biodiversity not to make any more roads. You'll be there. If you ask rich countries to also do biodiversity intactness, their the efficiency is lower, so you're on the higher side of 60%. Okay, so that's what we want to do, which has a problem for India because that means we have to really increase intact nature. And right now the boundary is 30, but that means there's a lot of work to be done. But then the second question is within cities and rural areas, the idea is you should have at least 20 to 25% green areas that are accessible per square kilometer. So that's the storyline, and in the European Union, the voluntary target, which we have not achieved, is you should be able to see 3 trees from your window because this is good for your psychological health. If you have a window, of course, you should be able to walk to a park of some sort or green area within 300 meters from your house, and 30% canopy every square kilometer. So that's the storyline, and that basically means that in constructing a city, you have to make land available for nature. In most developing countries, they focus on large parks. That's not good enough because a park may have an entry fee, which makes it inaccessible. It may be too far. You don't have a bus ticket, you can't go. So it needs to be everywhere. And the other problem in many developing countries is when you invest in a green area, the price goes up, and then you have gentrification problems. So the poor people get shifted out. And we hope that the 1 square kilometer target will help address that problem as well. So that's the issue of the boundaries. Now, these boundaries means that there's very little water you can use because you need water also for city parks, city greening, as well as for the other areas. Then the next question is, so now I've done the boundary. You can just look at, think of it as a cake and with a limit. The next question is, can you meet minimum needs of people within that? So you could say between 50 and 100 liters of water are what people need for cooking, bathing, toilets, a sanitation system needs water, so that's also part of this. So maybe you need between 50 to 100 liters of water per person. But you also need water for your energy, and you need water for food production, and you need water for your house, water for your health, water for your education.
So for your basic needs in the SDGs, for the social, so if you add it up, and we haven't added everything, we've only added the water for food, water, energy, and infrastructure, bit of housing, bit of temperature, the transport. If you add that up, it increases the impact on the system quite substantially, because you're multiplying it through a number of equations to reach the impact on CO2 emissions, on nitrates, on water use, on water pollution, etc. So, what we can do is calculate the boundary and the foundation using the same units. And then we see exactly how much water is left over. And you can do this exercise globally, and you can do this exercise nationally, and you can scale it down locally. So, my gut feeling is, so on climate change, I can tell you that if you go to pre COVID year, if you meet basic needs of people, and I excluded education and healthcare and a telephone, I excluded those three. If you do that, the impact on greenhouse gas emissions is 26% above existing levels. So, what does this mean? This means that we are outside the boundary today. If you meet minimum needs, you go further outside the boundary. So the only way to come back inside the boundary is to redistribute, which brings me back to the first point I made earlier. At a certain point, I can get richer and richer, but I can't buy anything anymore from this theoretical story, because my footprint has been crossed over and over again. And if I invest and there are good investment rules, I can't even invest anymore. So the motivation to keep money will go down if you're able to develop the system properly, which means you might be able to help get more taxes through tax justice, and try to reduce tax evasion and avoidance, and come back to this storyline of funding basic needs. That was my fifth point. And where are cities in this? Because cities overuse resources, and cities are a concentration of very rich people, they are massively overusing their footprint. So you basically find that cities are using up all the rights of the villagers, and then there's nothing left for the villagers. So if you want to make space available for the poor urban dwellers, and the rural areas, you need to make sure that the lifestyles of the rich people get changed. And I'll just give you an example. You might think that some of you are also in that category. Maybe your parents are quite well off. But if you look at the Australian billionaires, they spend in 1 hour of greenhouse gas emissions on their boats as much as an average Australian spends in a year. So we really have to cut the upper end as much as possible. And of course, many of us will have to start tightening the belt. My last point is that this transformation process that we are talking about really requires radical transformation of the economic system, the financial system, the governance system, the legal system, and basically requires all of us to think together how we do this. And of course, it's not enough to just tell the story, because this is our research. There has procedural justice needed. So this means we have to debate about it and see, do we think it makes sense as an academic storyline? And then do we think it makes sense as a political storyline? And then where do we go from here? Thank you.
Thanks, Joyeeta. So I'm going to be impolite and suggest that maybe one thing you can take away from what you said was that both cities and rich people steal from other places, other species, and other people in their own neighborhood. And in a sense, the frameworks we're talking about, and that's why procedural justice is so important, are stacked against us. And the sort of interstitial informal markets are some way of trying to survive in the cracks. But the rules are stacked against us. And the rules are stacked against us because of the rules of property, which people don't realize are, one of the other things that was implicit in, I think, what everybody is saying is that water connects everything, but it's not explicit, it's hidden. The fact that water connects food, most economic activity, etc., is kind of obvious, but it's not so obvious because it's not actually valued properly, and it's not priced in some cases. So people don't actually value it. So they can go to the limit and go beyond it, and it doesn't make a difference, especially people who can consume a lot of that. So I guess one of the questions is this sort of institutionalized inequality of some people having land and hence the water under it, some people having access to resources because they're able to control it, and others not having it. How does one think about kind of undoing that? Or is there some way in current institutional mechanisms or within legal frameworks that we can think about actually shifting and changing that?
So if you look at normal justice processes by courts, so if I have a very large house and you come to me and you say you have too much land, we need some of that house for somebody else, then most of the time I can go to court and get some kind of compensation for the expropriation. Now, this makes rich people richer because most of in South Africa, in the case study, we found that the water entities can't pay this money. So then they just ignore the rich people because they cannot. And so this means that we have to move from a narrative of conservative justice to ideal justice. And you can only do that by putting recognition, epistemic justice, and all the three I's into the framework. So once you tell a judge that actually the framework has to change, and this person has historically, knowingly or unknowingly, overused their resources, and it's time to change the balance without going into a revolutionary mode, because you can also revolt, we can also cut off people's heads, but that's not the idea right now. So if you want to do it like that and you present all this data, the judges are forced to consider all these elements, and slowly you see that they move from a conservative approach to a more radical approach, and through history you've seen that.
So that's for the judges. What about the politicians? What about the executive?
So that's why I was saying the story of the Australian billionaire, because that is less threatening. If everybody in this room feels threatened that they have no future, and if our colleagues feel that, then no action will happen. So you have to isolate some communities for further examination. So inequality of income is one story, but inequality of wealth is so big that that is the area that we have to focus, and they won't miss it. Most of these people earn so much that they will not even miss it if they lose several hundred thousands or millions of dollars and euros, and that needs to come up, I think. And the problem is, if our politicians are from the upper classes with lots of wealth, it's difficult. But if the politicians are quite rich but not in the top classes, then maybe there's a mobilization possible.
So yeah, so what you're saying is that the wealth inequality also reflects, and wealth inequality is not only with individuals, it's actually with firms.
Yeah,
Because the firms control tremendous amount of capital, and capital is what drives things. Wealth inequality is something that we have to look at very closely and link that to inequality in terms of access to water. So how does one bridge this?
so right now what we are doing is, in the Earth Commission we have a sort of a volcano figure.
Okay.
And what we say this is the minimum and that's the limitarian rights.
Yeah.
So the upper maximum. And what we want to do is, people are stuck in their poverty trap, which is here. So we're trying to help them come to this by creating a law on minimum rights and exploring that. And then we want to help them to come to the top of the volcano, and then maybe there is a sort of a steady state with a minimum and a max. And then you have, on the other end, you have a limitarian standard. That's what we're working on right now. And the sort of like a family of four is not bigger than 80 square meters, is what you see in the literature. So if you can then say everybody above this tail is brought back in because they are massively overusing resources and wealth, then you have quite a lot of money over here that can be funneled back over here to help these people move up. That's the narrative. I mean, that's the thought experiment that we are doing.
And how would that work? Through markets?
Through tax justice. A lot of it will be through tax justice. A lot of it, it can't be through markets. It has to be through the taxation system, and to close the loops of tax evasion and tax avoidance. And you see that the European Commission is now really busy with trying to catch the biggest tax avoiders in the world.
Okay, so that's interesting, because you're talking about a whole string of fiscal and in some senses monetary and other instruments to try and deal with justice, as far as bringing the long tail on the overconsumption in at one end. Kavita, what do you think about this? How does this work in the Indian environment? This is a very interesting thing that Joyeeta has laid out just now, saying, okay, don't have a revolution, but there are other ways of actually making this happen. So
I don't know why she's not calling it a revolution, because to me it seems very revolutionary. No, I don't know actually. I was just thinking how you would, quote unquote, operationalize this. I don't know, but I think the answer is through politics. So, and that's why you asked how would it work. And I just was thinking of a very, maybe a tangential example, but while we've been working in Tamil Nadu, and at some point we realized that relatively, I mean, people in Tamil Nadu don't always agree, but relatively, people in Tamil Nadu have got access to services, whether it's water, sanitation, whether it's healthcare, right? The cities, they are. It's not like Karnataka with Bangalore creating a huge skew. It's a uniform pattern of urbanization relatively. They have manufacturing, they have jobs, and so I and the colleagues really started, okay, what enabled this? An efficient bureaucracy, sure, yeah. And the answer actually just took us back to the Dravida movement, and it's a social movement which kind of uplifted the lower caste, and it goes back to that. And it I don't know, was it a revolution? It was definitely a movement. So something that actually gets people together to push for this thing is the only way that I see it realistically happening, because what Joyeeta is talking about is not just restricted to bureaucratic things. I think, on the other hand, if you have to move more instrumentally on making things work at a city level, then what she's talking about, taxations, and what she's talking about, the money instruments would work. But I think on the higher level, I think it's the politics, because what we didn't talk about, and everybody, let me just, since I work on the urban, let me bat for the urban. The thing is, urban, on the water side, the usage is not that much compared to, say, agriculture, which nobody wants to touch.
No, no, but it is through food.
It is through food. Yes, but agriculture is not only about food. And if you see the water consumption in India, we were discussing with Jagdish, so high. So my point was, who's going to who's going to bell the
Cat.
sugarcane farmers in Maharashtra and other states and
Yeah.
say that's not appropriate? So what I'm saying is the answer is through the political workings. I was just trying to reiterate that.
So, just to come back on this, politics is failing us in many parts of the world. And part of the reason that politics is I have two arguments for that. One is that many people in, say, rich countries, they don't want to rock the boat and they think it's going quite well. So let's postpone any painful action to the future.
including
With
climate.
like climate, and now they're facing a problem because they can't change their society, so they are getting voted out and new governments are coming in. So that problem of politicians not taking accountability on the rich countryside, and in the poor countryside, of course, there are other dynamics. So that's where the court is important. But you're absolutely right. But the reason why social movements, they need to be fed. So if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, they didn't really have a good theoretical understanding about what do you do to improve the system. So then your movement gets a little wasted. So if you have created an academic basis which we can discuss with you all, and you can come back and say you got it wrong here or there, then we have a story to feed into social movements, to move the process, a story to feed into judges, to move it. Because I'm not sure that politicians themselves will just say, hey, it's okay.
Oh, but also, just maybe I was not clear. It was a social movement which actually entered mainstream politics, and there was a lot of debate when that actually happened. And some of the founders of that movement said, "No, don't do this." If I'm wrong, just correct me. But the point about that is, it just didn't remain a social movement. It influenced and entered mainstream politics in a very, very big way. And so my point was, unless you're able to make water an issue in that similar way, or even the whole issue of equality, I don't see the structure.
But in the Netherlands, the social movement is of farmers saying we have a right to emit greenhouse gases, and they've got into politics and they are saying we don't want any climate policy. So, the problem with the social movement approach is that you have both pros and cons.
Interesting. So Jagdish, just to pick up on that. So we've talked about, yes, maybe social movements and politics can influence the floor, fine. But how do you pull yourself back from the boundary? You think social movements can do that? We talked also about individuals actually doing this through behavior change. Markets can shape that kind of stuff. How do you really pull yourself back from the boundary?
We have examples of social movements in the environmental sector in India that have contributed to conservation and environment ecological stewardship. So we have the Chipko Andolan in the Western Himalaya. We had the Silent Valley movement in Kerala, which cut across large sections of society. Of course, it's a different type of society there, and high literacy in terms of the politics ideology also that played a role. But you had, within the same party, you had people arguing for the dam and against the dam, and for the lion-tailed macaque, and for saving the rainforest. And ultimately, the decision to to shut that dam came from the top, from the prime minister, but the voices of the people of Kerala and in newspapers in Malayalam, not it wasn't an elitist movement, and it had people from various parties in some sense joining in. It was, I would say, a remarkable example of a social movement contributing to an environmental ecological outcome that was ended up as a happy ending. So we should not, and we have other movements we've had about against dams and certain many other there are. It's just that the constituency, the political agency of in terms of environmental change, I think that is very fragmented. So you would have, I mean, you have farmers of various kinds. So that's, we have seen examples of that being mobilized. But if you look at, for example, all the, say, cities and settlements along, say, the Ganga, who would you think would have a stake in a better, cleaner Ganga and more? They are fragmented in different constituencies. So there was at some point in parliament they tried to bring together the members of parliament of all the constituencies which were along the Ganga to make some sort of a group, but it didn't go very far. So I think that and you know, we've seen in Bengaluru Hesarghatta, which was the grassland which used to, in fact, it's one of the two reservoirs which used to supply water to Bengaluru earlier, Tippagondanhalli and then Hesarghatta. Hesarghatta was going to be, some of it was going to be earmarked for a film city. And then there were citizens mobilized against it. There was a signature campaign, and eventually Hesarghatta has been declared as a conservation reserve. So I think that if we can find a political constituency for ecological conservation and environmental stewardship, I think that is something that we really need to think hard about, why we don't actually have that constituency. And in some cases, we've seen examples from the past. I wish there were more examples from more, you know,
More
recently. But I think this is something that we have to seriously think about.
Thanks.
Sorry, Aro, just because
Yeah. Okay, go ahead. And then we'll open it up.
1 minute.
Mm.
Because to the question that you asked, Jagdish, I feel like even though social movement and politics are the beginning point, if the change has to happen and it has to come back, it has to happen through institutions and the existing ones. But I can say with confidence, not only what we've seen in Tamil Nadu, but in other states like Odisha and Delhi. And, you know, there have been examples where remarkable change has been brought about in a short period of time because the political leadership wanted it. So I think all those are second degree questions and it is possible through the institution. But yeah, I guess the politics of it has to come first.
Good. Nice way to open a discussion. So, floor's open, folks. Questions, comments, counterpoints. And of course, there are people online too. So, can we start with the floor here and then go online after that? Anybody who has, yeah, please. Just quickly introduce yourself. So, some of us are not from the. Yeah.
Oh, I'm just a layman. I'm very interested in all this. That's why no introduction. Is it time, this esteemed panel, to revisit this global economic developmental model of cities as engines of growth? Either revisit or redefine. Isn't it high time? Because that's the major thing causing a whole lot of, as you said, water is connected across spectrums. This is one of the things that's connecting everything.
Thanks. That was the impolite question I didn't ask Joyeeta, saying there's something wrong with that development model. And they, yeah. So
Wrong.
no, absolutely. And how do you work it? Can we pick up another couple of comments, questions? Okay, so Zenith is there. Zenith is saying, wow, it's a long question. Yeah, the last line. What's your comment on agency and capacities of municipal local government in India, particularly in tier 3 and tier 2 cities and towns? Okay, fine. That's kind of relatively easy. We got anything else after that?
There's many more.
Oh, many more. Okay. So, availability of land to reach 30-30 targets. Okay, so the technical question is now. So let's take the big question about growth and cities.
So I want to separate.
You need the mic, please.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm going to separate out the development and the city storyline and then link them. The development problem has always been that rich countries saw themselves as developed, poor countries as underdeveloped. And then there was this whole structure of, you go from LMIC to middle income country to high income to very high income country. And so by that, they created an aspiration of development, which is completely and totally unsustainable. So that's one of the big problems we have today. And in the climate arena, both of us have to get to zero at the same time because of the inequality of the past. But what you see is that you can't afford to become as rich as the North and then come down. That would be unbelievably impossible because the aspirations you create are insufficient. On the city story, I have a completely different approach to this because all the global scientists are saying that by in the next 20-30 years, more than 70% of the global population will be living in cities and nobody will be living in villages. And I think that with internet and connections, you will find that the city areas will become much better people will be happier to live in the rural areas and jobs will move there because you don't have to sit in the city to go to university. You don't have to sit in the city to work. So I'm hoping that in fact we will see a return to villages, but that does not mean you have a house bigger than 80 square meters. So you still have that limit to the size of your house or the size of your footprint. So
Will you grow your own food or?
you may grow your own fruit, but the problem is you can't always grow everything efficiently in your own land. So in Africa, the whole storyline is, can we address poverty and food insecurity by ensuring that all people have small vegetable gardens? It's a good idea, but you don't have the water, so it's very difficult to organize.
Okay, Max, any other comments on the city growth and?
Yeah, I mean, see the cities as engines of growth, I think is an incomplete statement. But cities are here to stay, no matter whatever it may change. And I don't think it's about cities are bad. And I want to reiterate because a lot of our work as an institution is here. It's not about whether urbanization will happen, but how can you imagine a different kind of urbanization? Because cities are not only places of growth, but where people come here for aspiration. And this goes back to Ambedkar's thing of coming to cities to get out of old. And so I feel that it's very dangerous to say cities are bad. I don't think that's the story. I think we have to ask what kind of cities we want.
That leads you on to that. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
You can also shift aspiration to the villages, that it can become a place for aspiration.
And it's a continuum, fine?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I just want to say, I mean, I think it's, we have to be realistic. Urbanization and large settlements and cities have been historically been there in ever since the surpluses from agriculture were available. And I think that when we think about this sustainability, I think that we have to think about sustainable cities and sustainable rural areas and hopefully some semi-wild and wild areas. This entire continuum sustainability, I think we have to think about, because I think cities are here and cities do great things for people. And I just hope that we can have a different imagination of the city, which will allow for sustainable transformations to happen in the future. I mean, that's something that we need to, I think about, because I don't think that at least in the foreseeable future see any. I know that there have been examples where cities have died out. We know from the Mayan and that's a very long period of time. So at least for the next many decades, I think that we'll have to think about both cities, villages, and other types of settlements in a sustainable framework together.
I'm going to come back to other people online just now. Can you respond to the question of capacities?
Yeah.
In
Sure.
smaller towns and how that plays itself out?
Sure. So
and maybe you can pick up on the 30 by 30 question. Can we have this? Yeah.
Yeah. So the question was, what about the capacities in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities? So 3 quick points. One is that I just want to say that people keep on talking about lack of public sector capacity, and then an argument is made for bringing the private sector in. But I can very confidently say that the capacities in the private sector is equally low, if not worse. So that can't be used as an argument for anything. Second is that if you're talking about capacities, you have to start with financial capacities, because a lot of cities, and particularly tier 2 and 3, are stymied by lack of their own finances, which also means they don't have enough human resources to work on it. And third, if lot of capacity conversation happens around technical capacity, yeah, sure, that may be a problem, but I think the bigger problem is the right incentive structure, because right now, honestly, that junior engineer sitting in like some corner of this country has no incentive to perform well or not. So people who are working out there are just doing it out of commitment to their work or whatever they're working on. So I would say these three issues are far more critical than any lack of technical capacity.
No, just to be so one of the things that we came out from the panel is that we have to open up to much more local politics and social movements. So, one thing is technical capacity to clean up water and do, switch on the lights and stuff like that. But you think there's an openness to local politics and a whole range of processes around social movements?
I didn't say local politics.
Okay.
I said politics.
Okay.
And I think maybe that was a trick question. The reason why I'm saying is that local politics can be counterproductive when it comes to water, because by nature, water, you don't want local politics to say, I will not. This is what has happened in Tamil Nadu, that I will not accept your other city's waste, even though it's on the boundary and like 50 meters away. So I think you do need politics. And yeah.
So you think there's openness as a capacity to engage with
openness from whom? Sorry.
at tier 2, tier 3 level?
Yes, there is. And I think it's easier to work with local smaller cities, because it's just less of the two things. One is smaller in scale. Secondly, it's also is not so entrenched in so many institutions as big cities are. So I do think there is an openness, and it's a good place to begin. But again, to reiterate that politics, local, it doesn't mean, it's centered, it's parochial politics. Yeah.
Sure. So they're making their way, Kavita is making the way down to the village. So we're somewhere in the intermediate area. saying no, small towns are a huge opportunity in some senses, because we're thinking sometimes about structural change in the metropolitan context, where a big shift happens because of a food riot, because it's caused because of something else, and the regime shifts. The closest you've seen just now has been Sri Lanka in some senses, where people go and jump up and down on the president's bed and stuff like that. Okay, so there's an intermediate transition that's possible as far as that's concerned. Jagdish, on the 30 by 30 question. Okay.
Yeah. So there's a recent assessment that was done on what the high priority biodiversity and ecosystem services hotspots are in India, and 85% of those high priority areas are outside our current protected area network, and the opportunity for us to actually spare more land and water under strict conservation is fairly limited, which means that instead of a land sparing approach, which was important for many species, they do require large habitats and intact areas. Land sharing will increasingly have to be the model for conservation and achieving sustainable management of land and water. And this requires a lot of work, a lot of innovation, and also mobilizing all sections of society, and also very different view of agriculture, of tourism, of everything else that we do. Then we can perhaps have agroecosystems which can also support biodiversity. You can have city parks and hopefully cleaned up rivers in cities, including the Yamuna, and also having aquatic biodiversity. So we have to imagine that the space for conservation is going to expand if we can think of a land sharing approach that builds in sustainability at all components, and that's the only way I think that we will be able to achieve our targets of conservation in the future.
But it also means that your new cities that you're planning must not have a huge land footprint. It also means that the current cities I'm seeing, they keep expanding from the side. They go bigger and bigger and bigger, and they take more and more land from outside. So the question is, how can we contain the city within a certain boundary and not allow the sprawl.
This is a very, very old debate in planning, fine, on containing the city and how do you manage that. Yeah.
No, sorry,
Kavita?
continue
No,
with
go
that.
ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
No, because what I was thinking is that we, to the gentleman's question and what we were saying, urban, good or bad, small cities versus large villages versus, it seems that we are in control. And obviously, as humans, if we have messed up this whole thing, we have to put systems in place to clean it up. But the fact is that whether it's urbanization or settlement structure, a lot of things are not going to be in control of so-called technical experts. And I think it really calls about a change in approach where sure you have targets and sure you have ways and you want to go there, but there is something to be said about adaptability and working better with organic processes. And I don't think we do that as practitioners. We either let things be as they are, or we have this template we want to go on, like new cities. But the real practice on the ground is somewhere in between, where you are responding to what is happening. I just wanted to make that process point, because we're all talking about all static things and they're not.
Yeah, of course. And that's what the whole thing about so-called informal spaces are. The more you have, the more cracks you have, more spaces you have for people to survive and to innovate. Most of our innovation actually is really in those spaces rather than in the formal structures. Though the issue is that procedural justice is very difficult to deliver in these informal spaces. They're captured by parochial interest. That's why Kavita reacted so strongly to the question of local politics, because that it captures very easy at that scale. Folks, any other questions from the room? Any other comments? I thought we would please, yeah. I thought we would have provoked you enough so that we'd get some.
Thank you. I have two questions. I'm very layman, as
So are all of us in this space.
yeah.
Otherwise, our
I
cities and
want
places would
some
be fantastic
expert
places.
views, as we were talking about the expansion of the cities, according to you, because some ideas are there, vertical or horizontal, and as cities are expanding, I come from Hyderabad and it's expanding tremendously. It is going to the wild. Which one is better?
That's a very difficult question to answer. Huh? It depends on context in some ways. There are certain levels of densities that you can manage things with, and some things that you can't. The challenge with us, of course, is not only horizontal versus vertical. It's also the question of access to land. The reason that you're having to go horizontal and vertical, and more than that, the blank spaces in between that you don't see on maps, where half the city lives. Hyderabad has got some elements of it. Go to Mumbai and you see it at much larger proportions, 55%, 60% of the population living in very, very high densities, but not very high. If you go to whatever, Dharavi, that's a classic example, you find 2.5-story houses, but the densities are extremely high. So the real issue that sits behind that is that our land markets are highly unequal, and that reflects on our water markets, fine? Some people have access to land, they control it, and other people are pushed out, they don't have access to that. And then the livelihood, where you work and how you play itself, is very rarely related to how the land is organized. And our transportation systems make it even worse, because poor people either have to walk or they use bicycles. And as the pollution and lack of access to water actually improves in our city, things become very, very difficult for them. And they actually are the lifeblood of the city. Most of us, let's say, who have a little bit more income and are better endowed, we are actually, we're I wouldn't say we're parasitical, because we may create a fair amount of value added, but we do not recognize the importance of everybody else in the city and their contribution to what's happening there. So the vertical versus horizontal question is how these things actually function. And we don't talk about the markets, but the markets actually operate and drive a lot of pretty nasty and good things. So they do good things in some places, but as far as land is concerned, that's one of our biggest challenges for housing, for access to services. And finally, the horizontal versus vertical city is related to how services are actually provided. And whatever we have at the moment, including in the city, is not designed to be able to take care of future expansion. So if you look at the city, the peripheries have no water supply. One, because there may not be too much water available in the Kaveri anymore. The second thing is it's growing so quickly that we are unable to provide the water. Or if we put the pipes inside there, the water doesn't actually arrive. So you have tankers going at night to make that happen. So we're not designing for a mix of what Kavita and our colleagues have done in Tamil Nadu, of what we call off-grid systems. Stuff that's not connected to the grid, where people have to survive and manage to do that, along with gridded systems. We know that gridded systems, in some cases, may be a good solution, but they may be so expensive that most people can't access it. So this is, I guess, coming back to the question of cities of engines of growth. If you don't actually reinvest enough proportion of what you're adding value in the city back in the city itself and its relationship with the countryside. The cities can't survive on their own, fine. There has to be enough that goes back to people in areas that are providing you with the water, that are providing you with the food, that are providing you with the ecosystem services. And if that linkage is broken, then you have a real problem. You have regional inequality. And then everybody will either want to come to the city to upend things or to come to the city to find things to work itself out. So, it's a lots of interesting trade-offs there, but it's always contextual. A city of this scale and size, 12 million people or more, should not exist on top of the plateau. There are only 4 other cities in the world like this. But it does because of economic drivers and economic reasons as far as that's concerned. So, sometimes these things drive things in various ways. But some people here may actually disagree with me quite strongly.
No, I just wanted to point out that, we call the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. So we work across the spectrum of settlements from small villages to mega cities. And you think of many places which are in the rural areas or smaller settlements that don't have the quality of service that maybe a larger city could provide. So if there is actually access to services in terms of education, health, and many other services, water, of course, is what was brought us all together. In some of those locations and sustainably sourced, some of them actually maybe even places which provide tourism opportunities or pilgrimage or other things for city dwellers as well. Perhaps this whole rural versus urban in terms of access to services and basic human requirements, if that gap could perhaps be bridged. We know that cities also have lots of problems for people, right? So it's not that coming here solves many problems for many people. So I think that this whole rural versus urban thing, we need to think maybe of thinking of whether certain services can be provided. Because I know examples in Bangladesh, for example, where fairly high quality medical services were provided to fairly for remote settlements by boat. So there was a different view of, you have a country which has got a lot of waterways and places which are not connected by road. And so there was a different imagination of how you can provide fairly good services, almost equivalent to what you can get in a city, but provided in those locations. So maybe we need to think a little bit more about
Do you have a follow-up question? Yeah, please.
Sorry, I have one more question. For transition to sustainable futures, especially in the term of water and water systems in urban, I'm sure you were. I came in the middle, and I came to know that you were talking about so many social movements which had led to quite many changes. Is there a tipping point for the change to happen, and can it be created, or you're waiting for something like COVID to happen and then things will change?
Social tipping points?
Well, there in the social tipping point literature, the focus is more on what kind of technologies and behaviors can change the way people behave. But I think what you're talking about is, will social movements work to change things? Now, what you see in this, is that what you were trying to say? Somewhat. Well, on that, we see with Extinction Rebellion, which is a really big global movement, and they're very frustrated that governments are not taking action to address the own extinction of the species of humans and others. They often they go to museums and they spray paint. They're not spraying paint on the pictures. They have actually a whole glass wall in front of it. And still the public reacts so negatively to that they say, we will not support Extinction Rebellion. So there is a point at which social movements create a counter reaction. So the question is, how do you create the social movement in a way? In my view, most of the social movements that have been successful are the ones that went to court and got a court order to change the way that project is run, and that eventually led to a regime change in the country. But the social movements that actually burn buses and things like that in some countries, so they get very extreme, or they do this, they don't function very well. And in some countries, the social movements, the people get killed. Lot of environmental activists are getting killed in many, in South Africa right now, and many other places as well.
Yeah, yeah, sure, absolutely.
I mean, we were, I think that was a part of a conversation about why social movements or change in politics is important. But it's not that as if this community is waiting for it. I think we are all working in our own ways, whether it's on institution, whether it's on conceptual work, or, working with the governments. It's just that some of the tricky things which involves fundamental restructuring of society, which is like saying don't consume. I think the point was that you need some social movements. And the hope is that all of this work that people are doing, many, many people, I mean, not in this room, everywhere, whether it's building evidence, whether it's working with governments, whether it's disseminating information, all of that hopefully will add up someday to lead to that tipping point. But I don't think the implication was that nothing is happening right now.
Yeah, the other, I mean, just a quick response on that. The thing is, if you look at some of the most radical changes that have taken place in the last, whatever, 150 years, many of them have grown from social movements inside urban contexts. So whether you look at trade unions who fought for 100 years to try and change labor conditions at one end, fine, or you look at questions, movements around gender justice, which have struggled for, I don't know, they the thing is, the city does provide you the opportunity to mobilize and do things which is not quite different. So if you look, for example, at the farmers movement that's there, over the last couple of years, we've seen it in India. The farmers movement, of course, is tied to the village, but a lot of the sustenance of that actually comes from smaller towns and their relationships. So I think the interesting thing about India is we have a mix of all of that. We have not become like Latin America at some end, where you really, the only fight that you have is you have to come in and take over a territory inside a large metropolitan area, and you're stacked against everything, the police, internal violence and stuff like that. So we still have spaces to do this kind of thing. But the question that I think Kavita had dealt with earlier, of the connection between social movements and political processes, both the big one, which is big political parties and how they mobilize, and small political processes, which deal with everyday things. Can I get water in the morning? Is the milk available to that? Is the ration shop working? Those kind of things are quite important. So building that social solidarity, which we saw both break down during COVID, and we also saw a whole range of creativity as far as that's concerned, where people stood together to survive, is something that I think is quite important. So there are ranges and ranges of politics, but effectively without some engagement, and because you're living in a very unequal world, right? And how much inequality can you manage with, and you can stand, and where is the response to that happening, whether it's water or land or housing or everything else, I think is a very, very sharp and important question we need to deal with. Sorry.
I just want to give an example which is quite inspiring. It's not directly, it is related to environment and ecology and people, everything. But if you go back in history, in the last century, there was a horrible rubber trade in what is now Zaire and what Congo. It emerged from the King Leopold in Belgium, and there were uh, women going, Quaker groups going, not very rich people in England who would go with a lantern because they only got time in the evenings after doing full day's work, and go and talk to people in different their villages and in small towns, and actually mobilize public opinion against something that was far away, happening far away. And that sense of injustice, I think that the rebellion, I mean, was there. I mean, it burnt in people's hearts and minds. And of course, it took a lot of other things before that horrible rubber trade could that could be, that exploitation and loot and plunder could be stopped. But it started in cities and small towns and all. And I think that's one example that's quite inspiring.
Yeah, and we have similar examples in this country. So I think I think that's sort of a good place to end on. It's been a good evening. Thank you so much for staying so long, and I hope you found it somewhat engaging.